You are listening to the Apocalyptic Education Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffani Marie, and a little later, the good Dr. Kenjus Watson will join me for our interview segment. Join us in a final farewell to schools in hopes that we might embrace its afterlife and implications for Black and other Indigenous frameworks of wellness. Oh my goodness, we are here. I am trying my best not to like fangirl because I know that's not cool. But also, however this happened, I mean, I was a part of it. I am so excited and nervous and humbled to welcome the one and only Amber McZeal, everyone. Goodness gracious.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Can I tell the story of us?
Please.
So
go right ahead.
You got to tell part of this too. Actually, can you start by talking about how you even came to understand this phenomenon?
You know, Cindy Bonaparte is deep, longtime friend, was the doula for our first child, and she was talking about epistemic violence and what she was learning about epistemic violence, and mentioned you and the work that you do, Dr. Amber McZeal, decolonizing the psyche. And so for me, I went to Google and found a podcast of you discussing just that. And it was so transformative. And I did what I often do when something's transformative. I've sent it right over to Tiffani and been, kind of learning from and following your work ever since.
Yeah. And we both had taught your work,
mm-hmm.
right?
So wild.
Which is intense.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
and then I'm on Facebook of all places, and I see Amber McZeal with somebody I went to high school with, and I was like, that's not the same. It can't be the same Amber McZeal, because the one I know in my imagination is like, I don't know, lives very far away and only does like exclusive events and prestigious podcasts.
Right.
And I was like, how does this Amber know my homie? And I actually hit my homie up. I was like, because I went to your Facebook page and I was like, all of the language checks out, but this doesn't make any sense to me. And then I asked my homie, I was like, hey, can you introduce us? And she was like, I guess, but what would the introduction be? Like, how do I explain that? And I tried. It didn't happen. And then a year later, you were tagged in something that and I was like, I got to try.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So I DM'd you, which no one does that on Facebook. I mean, people do it, but like I don't do that. And you replied in like 10 or 15 minutes.
Which is weird because I'm never on Facebook in an engaging way. It's more like drop a seed,
Right.
hitchhike out.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Amber replies, and I'm like, and I mean, here we are.
Here we are.
Here we are. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yes,
Thank you for having me.
Today.
Thank you for receiving what I have to share in this world at a time like this.
Oh.
And I love that you both shared the stories. I'm sure we'll dive deeper into it, but relationality is important and it's significant. The person who was the connector, even if she didn't make the direct connection energetically, she was the road. And so that's,
yeah,
I think.
Full agreement. Well, can you start us off by sharing about your personal journey and how you think you got to a place where people were nervous and excited to meet you? Like, what would you say, or, was that route? And if you want, like, to add some of the influences and such that kind of shaped you in that journey.
Yeah. That's such a funny way of phrasing the question, but I love it. So I first got to start with I'm Amber from Lafayette, Louisiana, born and raised. My people date back in that region to about the 1700s. So I would say the Haitian ancestors are the reason folks are gravitating toward what I have to share. Um, let's see. Yeah, I grew up there, and I guess I'll give a bit of an overview of how I got to decolonizing the psyche, depth psychology, and the ways that it has spoken to or intersected with your
Yeah.
works, apocalyptic education. So I first started out with just an interest in nature as a kid. I loved the hurricane season best. I would go outside, watch all the trees. So I would say now with grown up language, I had an affinity for the animate world.
Mm-hmm.
What was animating the wind, the water, what was pushing the lightning, things like that. Um, my undergrad work and thesis was around the power of sound and frequency to heal trauma. And that was seated in my consciousness when I was young. I grew up in a home that had a lot of fire or heat within it, which meant there was a lot of anger at times, a lot of ruptures. And I remember in middle school distinctly, um, my first period in middle school was choir. And so, first thing in the morning, that's what the class I would go to. But I'd be coming from an evening that was perhaps filled with chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And I would feel my cells sort of shatter at home in the afternoon into the evening. And then I'd go to choir first thing in the morning. I'm an alto, no shade to the sopranos. But I'd sing in those 4-part harmonies and I'd feel my cells or something sync up again. And then I'd go home again and the splinter or the shatter. And then, so you do that in repetition a few times and it sort of sticks. Years later, I went on to college in New Orleans, studied jazz vocalization. Katrina, which I call the glory wave, sent me out here to California. And from there, I slowly went into the undergrad pathway studying the sound therapy. And that was my focus of study in a self-directed liberation pedagogy program at Goddard College. I studied vibrational theories and sacred intellectualism. And what I will say at this point, to sort of ground all of that, is most of my journey, especially academically, has been intuitive. A hit comes, a hit happens, and then I follow up on it and see what comes of that. I've been grateful and graced with pleasant surprises. From the sound work at Goddard, I started having a lot of dreams. And so part of my thesis included an appendix of just 50 pages of dreams. And then graduation evening, one of my cohort members said, "What are you going to do after this?" And she introduced me to depth psychology. Like, oh, it's a place where you can go study dreams. I didn't know who Carl Jung was or anything like that. So I jumped into the somatic depth psychology program, did the master's there, navigated some racial ruptures and challenges in that program, and then transferred into the community liberation, indigenous, and eco-psychology program. And that's where I got my footing in decoloniality, decolonial theory, and that gave birth to decolonizing the psyche.
I was at a training this past week, and there was this woman there who I was terrified of talking to because she had already given me a look like, don't talk to me. And it was received. But I had a dream about her during the conference. And it was a very specific dream where I was asked to take care of the plants in her house. And I was so scared. I didn't want to kill any of her plants. And I watered them, and then I saw her the next day, and my roommate from the training was like, "You should tell her." I said, "There's no way I'm telling this woman who already gave me that look. I was dreaming about you last night. Like, we're not doing that."
Mm-hmm.
But that morning, she said hi to me. And I was like, I'm gonna do it. So I told her the dream, and she brightens up, and she was like, "My sister's name is Tiffany. Tell me more." And I told her that I was watering, in the dream, I was watering a spider plant for her. And she was like, "I have a spider plant." And there was a dream interpreter there, actually. So we engaged in some powerful ceremony. Do you have any ideas about the dream?
Oh, Jesus. Well, from the
Kenjus'
bird's
face.
eye view, not necessarily dreams, but I can speak to the nature of dreaming.
Yeah.
Because that does relate to like what it means to decolonize a psyche. So let's unpack it in a practical way with your dream at
Let's
the
do it.
conference.
Let's do it.
Here's an idea with in-depth psychology, but it precedes that. It's from indigenous peoples, the way they have navigated and understood the world. That the things we can't see have data. They have psychic content. In depth, we call it the unconscious. Literally, you are unconscious in sleep. But something expands, something spaces out, and you're all of a sudden navigating an interconnected metaphysical web, right? Like you and that person coming to you in the dream.
Yes.
So different pieces of information that are probably relevant to you and perhaps to her will pop up in those spaces. It's also the site or place of ancestors. So symbolically, I'm not going to interpret your dream for you, but what I can offer is a guide or a strategy. You take the symbolism of what comes up and really try to stay away from literalism. Like it's not a spider plant. It could actually be the essence of spider. Well, what are the stories of spider? There's grandmother spider in the Navajo tradition. There's Anansi in West African cosmologies, right? And so the meaning making comes when you start to slow down and tap into what the image, the living image of the dream is trying to communicate to you. Yeah.
In that invitation to slow down, you've in these experiences that you've shared have had these really powerful encounters seemingly with the sacred. And what I witnessed right here was a invitation for guidance in encountering the sacred. And I'm wondering about some of the people who've been important for you as guides, physical mentors or leaders, or maybe even going back to some childhood, rememberings, the trees or Oya, wind, hurricane. Who are some of the guides that have been important as you've moved through your life path?
Well, since her name has already been brought up, we do have to say Hekwaheyansa is the honoring name word for her. Oya, the deity or the consciousness of the hurricane or storm. I'll say this first. Through my academic journey, I chose the phrase sacred scholarship to decolonize my own mind as I navigated and, what do you call it? Completed all the necessary requirements there. So Oya was one of the first deities, orishas, out of the Yoruba cosmology in Nigeria that came to me. And I was pretty young. I didn't learn about who she was until like middle school, then well into high school, early college years, to make the connections, especially with New Orleans, connection between New Orleans and Cuba and Nigeria and Brazil. But those experiences, that one, and then recognizing the same sensibilities in teachers that I met, that sense of empowerment, or recognizing why did I have an affinity for protection of women. Oh, that's a feature of Oya. She protects women. Let's see. Oh, there's so many mentors that I adore. One I'm thinking of right now is Dr. Fanny Brewster. She was a part of my dissertation committee. One of the very few early Black female depth psychologists on the planet. Carl Jung, notoriously a man of his era, a Victorian era man, but one of his assertions was that Black people don't dream. Now, what's interesting about that is his theories of the psyche were crystallized in his trip to Africa, after his trip to Africa at 50. So it's a contradiction, but what isn't, right? Dr. Fanny Brewster has spent her career correcting that pathology and bringing from the margin to the center the way that we define and navigate our inner world. So she's a beacon. She's also a very tender woman. One of her latest books is Archetypal Grief in African American Women. It's about the legacy of child loss through colonization in North America.
Goodness.
And how we navigate and integrate that. So she's highly influential around the intersection of the sacred and the mind.
The spaces of the sacred. When you came in, you were humming, and then when you came back downstairs, you were singing. What were you singing, if you don't mind sharing?
Oh, how lovely. I'd be delighted to share. It's Toby and Guigwe. The newest album, the track is I'm Not God. I think it should be the healer's anthem, or anyone in a liberation focused field, because the hook is I want to save you, but I'm not God. I want to heal you, but that's not my job. So it's a song about recognizing both free will. Can I cuss on this? Oh, please. Free will is a bitch, and all of the humans have it. And the sincerity of wanting to help somebody, especially when they won't receive your help. Yeah.
Do you sing?
I do.
Aren't you like a professional singer?
I am compensated for my artistic contributions in the world.
That's a lovely way to put it.
Yeah. Like how do you understand? So then we can understand you as an artist. How do you understand the relationship between your art and music, for instance? You're an orator too, right?
Yeah.
How do you understand kind of those realms in relationship to academics, or the idea of you being like a activist as well, like an artivist? How are you understanding the relationship between all of those entities?
Yeah. So the phrase, if I may offer one that guides me on that tip, is the sacred and the mundane. So after the Goddard journey and looking at vibrational medicine and theories, I landed on quarks. Have you ever heard of quarks? It's in string theory, where basically the fundamental component of everything we see is a vibration. It's all frequency. It's all energy. Nothing new under the sun. Somebody said it in China like 72,000 years ago, as well as other places on the earth. There's an understanding about this, that vibration, even the notion that is still a figment. Like the atoms are still moving, just at a very, very, very slow rate. So something about that, and again, circling back to the experience I had in youth, it was formidable, that frequency. There was something about it that had an edge, a sharpness to it, that can be used for generative endeavors or to destroy. So I hold that when I perform. I hold that when I choose to say yes or respectfully decline an invitation. I hold this idea that what I'm putting behind that frequency I'm emitting might cut through the wall of something or someone. And so there's some intentionality around it. Funny story. While I was at Goddard, First Fridays in Oakland was in that transition from being like artist led and run and all that to city sanctioned permits, working with the cops. And I was part of the artist organizing group. And I wrote a sound vibrational manifesto that went absolutely nowhere. No one cared. They wanted their permit to sell their hot dogs, but I was trying to say, like, what about the power of this? And I think now with AI, as we move into the dawning of the age of Aquarius and all that great stuff, um, some of this stuff is becoming more relevant. Like, wait a minute, I'm saturated with data and information, and the things I hear are suddenly shifting the way I feel. Is that a thing? Yes. Yes, it actually is. Maybe what was required is that we experience that at an accelerated pace for the human family to take it seriously again.
And by AI, you mean artificial intelligence, not ancestral intelligence.
Correcto. Artificial intelligences. That's a good one.
Yeah, I look back at you and you was already looking at me. What were you thinking?
Acceleration. I mean, the idea of acceleration just came to my mind about something that our pediatrician nutritionist said about the world that we're in. She was talking about how young girls are having their periods or cycles begin earlier than ever that they've recorded. It happened because our daughter had like smell underneath her armpits, and she's 5.
Wow.
But that's not uncommon, right? Relative to the general population of children that they're looking at, is that they're entering puberty earlier and earlier. And she was talking about everything being accelerated. We recently, where I live in Piscataway lands and what's known of as like Maryland, Baltimore, we recently had like a summer that was really much earlier than it had been. And now we're in fall, or it's, earlier than it should be, maybe than what people are experiencing. And things are just kind of moving quickly. So that was the first thing that came to my mind around acceleration. But I think the other parts, and I'm interested in what came up for you, but I'm thinking about how you're so beautifully, we were joking earlier about like, it takes a lot of work to appear effortless, but there's so much work behind the way that you're navigating realities that seem to be very discordant, right? Sacred scholarship, for many people, those are like, what, right? Vibrational sound, energy, and healing alongside Western modes of quantum physics catching up to indigenous ways of being and knowing. And so I have thoughts or questions around how you have come to move through and navigate these seemingly discordant sounds between the West, modernity, colonized ways of being and doing and knowing, and our indigenous grounded knowledge systems, sciences, so effortlessly, even though I know there's effort and there's work and there's commitment and practice, but just trying to learn, really from your journey around that.
Yeah. As you were talking, asking the question, the first thing that came to mind in response was, I am the dissonance. And I have a passion for creating harmony. I like it. I think it's fun. But there's the how of it, I would say in one word, it's acceptance of that dissonance. And to unpack that a bit, what does that mean? I am the dissonance. I am the tension of oppositions. I am a French bloodline and a Chickasaw bloodline from Mississippi and Louisiana, and a Mali, Senegal, Nigerian bloodline. I'm all of those things creolized into one human being with disparate, discordant stories behind each lineage. And so I have the words and the language now after a couple of years working in ancestral healing. I didn't before. But with the language now, in this one good life, I consider it my responsibility to figure out how to navigate the tension of those oppositions, not to reject any of it. Because where's it going to go? What am I going to cut out the 19% French and put it where? What kind of knife do I use?
A cheese knife, probably.
A cheese knife, a brie, or a serrated?
Or fragua.
Okay,
Straight face while he said
And not to push down or dismiss distinctness at all. I value distinctness. Like I'm different from Tiffani, and that's great because I can get to know Tiffani. But the ways in which coloniality has engineered such rigid separation that would have someone turn to the self and say, cut out the French part. I don't want that part of my legacy. Rather than, which is what I chose to do, turning toward it and saying, how can I alchemize this? What are the necessary tools, ingredients, perspectives, cup of love that will help me move into the integration of this inherited legacy? Yeah, sadly, that's not something they taught me in public school.
What's that about?
Yeah.
There's a reserve about you. I think my follow-up was similar. There's a reserve that a friend of mine sent me a passage from this book that was saying people get the healing language and use it as a tool to prove a point, to move an audience toward their end goal that can also be separate from healing. But they can take healing language and use it to change the culture in a space. But that doesn't mean that healing happens there. And I was like, yes, I've been wooed by a number of people. And then how they practice that hurts a lot. Or how they don't practice what they're talking about hurts a lot because they were so good at using their words as a tool.
Yeah.
Now, there's a reserve, though, about you where we haven't spent that much time together, but it's something even in the pacing of your words, your disposition that reads, one, like, don't mess with you. Two, the alchemizing that you talked about seems very real and raw. And I have so much curiosity around, because I'm trying to, there's certain days where I'm like that. Are there certain ingredients that support me to be that way? But in our pre-interview, in the podcasts I've heard, and right now, there is a reserve. I want to keep going back to that I have so many questions about. And I'm curious of how.
She said how.
How.
Just HOW.
How. Yeah.
You know how maybe you have or haven't heard the reverence or the respect for death, knowledge, awareness of it builds reverence for life.
Yeah.
Right?
I've heard that.
You heard that?
Yeah, for sure.
So I would say in response to that, I know the chaos, and so I exalt peace. There's an element of to use some astrology divination. I do have a stellium in Scorpio, so while it may show up very composed, there's an acceptance of the disintegration, what I call the decolonial death rituals. That happens usually in very contained, intimate, secured, grounded spaces. That now that I've moved into my fourth decade on the earth, I've gotten comfortable in cultivating for myself. Goddard was a place like that. Undergrad on the heels of Katrina, the rug had already been ripped.
Yes, yeah.
And Goddard was a place that had established the protocol for letting you fall apart. It's in the falling apart, like Chinua Achebe's book, Things Fall Apart. They do. How else will compost happen? How else will you get to the new thing?
Yes.
Unless, and not having it ripped away from you, but allowing it to fall away. And understanding the wisdom of, okay, as this falls away, it's going into the cycle of something else. Goddard's tagline was trust the process. Many people were like, I don't trust anyone. But okay. And they did. They trusted the process and the intimacy with process, like in nature. Nature has a process.
Yes.
Going back to acceleration, now that we've sped up the growth process, our tomatoes taste like crap.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right? So trusting the wisdom, the genius of that process kind of ensures the bloom of a thing, whether that's the material fruit of the tree or the psychical gold that we're trying to excavate.
Yeah. When you're offering that, my mind is going to, or maybe my heart, it's like multiple points of connection here to, I was listening to, I think I mentioned this in the pre-interview conversation, this indigenous activist who was talking about the differences as she saw it between, or connections between decolonization and re-indigenization. And she really placed it, she was trying to talk again to the West and saying, so plasticity in the brain, to your work around neurodecolonization, there are literal synapse connections that have been wired that decolonization is asking us to unwire. So my response to moments of being activated around what I've studied around like microaggressions, I call those mnemonic activators, right? Everyday reminders of the suffering of your people. So a response to that was wired over many generations because of what the original intent was or the ongoing intent. So unwiring or decolonizing might be similar or different from the new connections that are made once we do that. But to me, that's how the West would look at it, right? Like, well, there's a different synapse you're developing, but the decolonial death ritual, to me, is the practices or protocols that are done, as you've talked about before, that help metabolize that trauma, to remove it from our collective culture as a cultural response, and not replace, but once that is released, as like Malidoma would say, like you make it through some trouble and it graduates you for a different kind of trouble,
Yes.
right? So that's how I think of what you're offering, is like this relationship from one way of moving into a different one. So a question I had for you around something another elder was saying. Now this person is past 100, well respected in their field, was saying that we've lost. We've lost as a people, as African peoples, indigenous peoples. We've lost to the opposition. And so in preparing our children, we should probably prepare them to navigate a world in which we have to not do the decolonial death ritual, but recolonize and continue to colonize ourselves in order to survive. But was asking me a question like, do you think we should do that, or should we be teaching our indigenous ways of being and knowing as a practical tool? And I'm wondering, you responded in the pre-interview, and I'm wondering if you have anything else to offer around that idea from the elder.
Well, respect to the elders, because I did grow up in the South. Yes, ma'am. No, sir, etc. And I get it. We get it. I would encourage us to get it more and find the capacity for respect for those strategies of survival. I don't know if y'all have seen on Prime or Paramount, it's called The American Society of Magical Negroes.
I've seen it. I haven't watched it.
It's a fun little flick, but there's just this one scene where he's recounting a story of his father, basically, getting shamed and pushed down in public and spat upon, and how he felt shame witnessing that of his father, and running home to tell the grandmother, father's mother, about the situation. And her response was, if he comes home alive, he has won. For the time. Respect. Respect that my people did not get lynched in Jim Crow, southern central Louisiana. Respect. Because frankly, those ancestors before 1808, Bois Caiman was the ceremony in Haiti, which then propelled them, gave them the gravity to defeat not one colonial power, but three. Okay. So to the elder, I think at this moment, this historical point, something that needs to be highlighted is decoloniality is not this new phenomenon that just emerged in the 20th century. It has been a concurrent river running alongside the very first time anyone said, I have dominion over you, human. I get to tell the other human that you are not human. I get to expel you from the human family. The moment someone thought, felt, or uttered it, much less put it in policy, that river of decolonization was already running. So the fervor, the gall, the courage to declare your humanity and dignity has always existed. I think what's most relevant for me, what's being birthed and decolonizing the psyche, is, to the elder's point, foster the critical consciousness about the place we live in. How did race get invented in 1672 in the 13 colonies? That's a thing. Go look it up. Bacon's Rebellion, you know what I'm saying? Like, learn those things. Learn what happened and let it sort of provide a container for the decolonial death ritual. Like, when I know what happened to Black women birthing during colonization in America, it allowed me to shed centuries of grief among the mothers in my families, right? It helped to release the angst around tense relationships between mothers and daughters in the American continent, right? Like, let it fuel that disintegration and release. To the other point of in the either or binary, should we then just teach indigeneity, et cetera, et cetera? It's my view that there is no going back to some romanticized past. We're here. There is a creolization that occurs. Like, we're probably not going to stop using technology anytime soon. We're not going to go back to like, where's the feather to find the water? Probably not. That was a great strategy when it was necessary, you know? But there are principles, most importantly, values and ways of being human and in relationship to everything else that's alive that are relevant from our indigenous worldviews. That's what's important to weave forward in a kind of Sankofa movement. To land it here on the earth, I'll offer a practical example. There's a concept. So we talked about in the pre-interview psychology and indigenous approaches to psychic well-being. And so psychology's premise is all about taking care of the self, the promotion of the emergence of your full self, your individuation. That same mission is at the center of Ifa. They use different language and terminology for it. One of those words around tending the self and getting to know yourself so that you can be a great contributor and participant in community is the Ori. The Ori being the spark of consciousness that you choose when you descend into the earth material plane. And it sort of contains your gifts, your talents, your taboos, your challenges, your blind spots, your inherited genius, etc. And the practice is getting to know your own Ori. So I adapted that as a concept into a guided somatic practice, a guided meditation. And so, yeah, where are the openings, especially with all of the limitations in traditional ed? Where are the openings? How can those limitations be an invitation, to the opening to create something new that is informed by an 8,000-year-old corpus, right?
Ashe. Y'all got into some, and I was trying to stay around the death convo in relationship to nature.
We can go back.
Well, I think what was coming up for me was the idea of human supremacy and this belief that actually ties deeply into what you were talking about, even the idea of the self, as if that's kind of primarily what we do in the West, is the self, the individual. And I think what y'all are sharing about death and transitions is there's so much fear. One, I think grounded in this idea that when you die, you are done. This is it. But then two, this idea that when you die, like, you become someone else's food, essentially, as if that is not one of the greatest honors that you could live for. And so much of like how we navigate life is about this here and like doing the most here because of the assumption that it will end, or your presence or your light will end, and that your presence and your light is primarily here for your pleasure or the people that you deeply care about. And I think there's something fascinating in what you were saying about the lessons of the natural world, the lessons that are present around the sacredness of who you are in relationship to how you exist amongst other people, with and around other people. So, I mean, I was driving and I wanted to get in the car and hear more about, I think these ideas I think you were touching on some really powerful ideas of relationship to I want to say death in scholarship, death in the academy. But I also want to leave it open for what just came to you as you were listening to me.
Well, your intuition is spot on because something did just come to me as I was listening to you. There's been the recurring emergence around this theme of pruning things in my work with myself and my own ancestors, my people, but also work with clients in the world. And to speak to that fear of death being the end, or this is the wall, if I cross that, that's over. As the metaphor, the practice of pruning emerges again and again, the message that's coming forward is you have to cut the dead thing off so that it can go on to the next phase of the process. So that fear of the cutting is like, no, hold this dead leaf onto the tree because it's the leaf. It has a personality. It wants to say it's brown. It's lost all the chlorophyll. It actually has a new purpose. And if you don't allow it to fulfill its new purpose, you are, in essence, interrupting the cycle. So the focus is less on the leaf, whether it's brown, yellow, green, whatever it may be. The focus is expanded onto the entire ecosystem, the larger cycle.
Yeah.
What colonization does, and hence the premise of decolonizing the psyche, colonization narrows that capacity. It gets smaller and smaller. You can't even conceptualize the whole system, much less participate actively and consciously in it, right? Not willy-nilly, haphazardly, like we do with death all the time. We're saturated with death. That's not what I'm talking about. In fact, it's the direct opposite, direct 180. It's very precise. It's very, it's articulated, you know.
I feel like everything you say is a award-winning poem.
It wins awards here on the AE podcast. You've won 7 in this conversation.
In this conversation alone.
Yeah.
Who would you say are some of the folks who kind of influenced, and we talked about this, but I'm thinking particularly to the story that you talk about in the pre-interview, being at a conference and this idea of decolonial love. I don't know if you want to go back to that, but thinking about the people whose lives widened things for you to be able to see the expansive nature of who we are, what we are a part of. And if you so feel led, like what did they do that supported that?
Well, I have 2 from the pre-interview. I was like, we only had 2.5 hours. I didn't get to say. On widening, my dissertation chair, Dr. Nuria Chiofalo, she's an author, editor, scholar. She did this thing. She did many things. She was a wonderful guide and midwife on that sacred scholarship ritual. But at one point, when you're in the thing and you don't realize you're doing a thing, you're making a mistake, you're trying to bite off way more than you can chew. She saw my bravado in what I was attempting to do or the way I was phrasing or articulating something. My research was on decolonizing maternal health care for Black women. So weaving decolonial theory into Black women birthing in America. And so I'm in and out of hospitals and all the stuff in San Francisco, Oakland. And at one point in her feedback to me, we're on a call, and she says, Amber, do you believe you're going to fix colonization by yourself? Like she saw me getting into that temperament, which we're socialized into in education. It's just me. I take it on.
Yeah.
I'm an individual.
Yes.
I produce knowledge all by myself. I am the objective one. Everyone else is a subject. All of those things. The lack of relationality. And she saw it, even though I wasn't saying it outright. She saw the, what do you call it? The residue. It's my own colonized socialization. She goes, you think you're going to fix this 800-year-old phenomenon by your damn self, sis? And I had no response. It just like, you know, when somebody clocks you in the jaw right quick and your bottom jaw just kind of goes to the right about 2 inches. It just stayed there like, oh, I didn't even know I was doing that. Or I was positioning myself to do that. So I share that because it was informative. In decolonizing the psyche, it was an experiential moment of me bearing witness to my own pillars, those inherited value systems and ways of being. And just recently, she actually circled decolonizing the psyche back to me in an academic forum out in the world. I was like, whoa, this is what real mentorship looks like. So somebody who's older and has farther sight can see you and what you're thinking and the road you're going on and goes, yep, that's the right thing. And that's not going to get you there. So go ahead and let that die. Come back to this other thing that you're trying to do. So there's that piece. The other is my other mentor, Dr. Nelson Maldonado Torres. And if I could offer a summary of what he conveyed in that experience, which I'll explain in a minute, but what he conveyed was the importance of humility as opposed to self-righteousness in rehumanizing ourselves. That's what decoloniality is. We've been through dehumanization. We've been through not only 800, 2,000 years. Like they were practicing torture as social control in France, like a hot second ago. So we're all in this process of rehumanization. However, in liberation spaces, sadly, sometimes our wounds can render us really ego-driven and presumptuous and self-righteous. Like we get up on our soapbox and we're in pain and we protect that pain by bashing other people and putting them down or making them feel insignificant or unsmart or like they didn't do the right thing or say it the right way. What he showed me, I was at a conference on decolonizing knowledge and power, but there was an incident where, keeping everyone anonymous, but the tension was around pronoun usage. We're in a global summer institute of 100 people who speak multiple languages. And this particular person was from a part of the world where they do not gender their pronouns. There are many languages around the world that don't do that. It's a Western phenomenon that we're grappling with. The she, he, her, they, whatever. It's from a certain branch of the language families, right? So another person who was American went on a tirade, a bit of a tirade, and without, pointing directly, but, alluding to, kind of berated this person and projected all kinds of things of like, this isn't a safe space and you don't have liberation in mind and blah, blah, blah. Sorry, didn't mean to do that. So went on a tirade, berated this person, and my mentor stood up and said, a part of decolonization is remembering that your way of being, especially Americans, it doesn't matter what ethnic group you fall into. America is a global superpower, full stop. And when you go elsewhere on the planet, that blue passport means hella shit. Okay? Try waving it around when you're in trouble. Okay. So my mentor said, part of decolonization is remembering that your way of being is not the center of the universe. It's just not. You think, which means the epidermalization that happens, our overemphasis on skin, because I'm a certain skin color, it means I'm super righteous. Actually, I could be just as fucked up as the next buddy. Just depends on the time of day and my choices.
Or if you ran for president,
or if you ran for president and like genocide and money. You know? So what if you got black skin? That too is a part of the decolonial project, moving away from the hyperfixation on skin color, because that was the premise to begin with. Hyperfixation for the purpose of creating a power hierarchy on skin color. So what does it mean to actually leave that behind? Not be fantastical or delusional about what has happened. In fact, just the opposite. Because I know what Bacon's Rebellion was in 1672, which is the first time they separated white from black in policy, because I know that, it lends more weight to me de-emphasizing and decentering skin color as some margin of morality or moral character.
Yeah.
That's going to mess some listeners up.
That's all right.
Which
That's
part?
all right.
All of it. No.
I don't
My
like
email
Porky.
address is don't even ask Tiffany. Come to me.
I think it's going to mess some people up because I don't know how much we realize that that's kind of what we are, where we are stuck. And we build our entire careers around a very particular way of understanding the world and how power works and who's right and who's wrong and what it takes to fix things, like entire careers. And those careers, I think, are undergirded by a lot of pain.
Sure.
And a belief that I am somewhere else. I am good now because I have this. And so that right there, just like in anybody who kind of, what is that, creates cognitive dissonance, there's this struggle around what to do with that. I think it's going to mess a lot of folks up. And it sounds, for me, I remember there was a professor, I won't say his name, he was doing this racelessness thing. He was trying to do this. And I think his attempt was to get where you just were. I think that was the attempt. But what came out was just maybe the perception that race is insignificant and that this is a black man who was a scholar. So maybe we should just do away with it. And then Toni Morrison writes in an essay, I forget the name of it, but it's in Source of Self-Regard,
Yes.
where she's talking about a woman walking home in the woods and she hears a crack and her knowing for sure in her body that she is safe. And that was a way of talking about race in a very particular way that I had never experienced, but it landed closer to kind of where you are right now or where you were just now. And I think that's hard because it can be interpreted as multicultural, like a multiculturalist, approach, which has been, especially in the context of decolonial education, frowned upon or seen as an inferior lens in understanding our world. I'm glad you said it. It's actually what Kenjus and I have very recently been talking about, and on our, opening episode, right, began to talk about where we each are today. You're inching, and I want to give it to you too.
No, I'm
You're
Listen.
inching. You saw him inching.
I did.
So I have said what I need to say. I'm curious about.
Racist.
I'm curious about why you were inching.
Black person moves. They go for the gun. I was in agreement. I think I was preparing for where you were gonna land it, and I had like different ideas about where that was because I had a request for Amber before we end.
I think that's where we need to go. But also, did y'all know that you can get from SFO to LA in like 30 minutes?
We got a hybrid.
You were
train?
talking about landing. No, I was on a flight that was an hour and a half late, and they still got us. And I felt it. This might be relevant or not at all. Mm-hmm. I felt the speed. At first, I wasn't tripping. It was the turbulence hit very different. Yeah. And then as we got closer and they had to slow down to land, that's when I was like, we were flying because it felt like you felt the brakes on the plane. I just said that in the air.
Yeah.
I just said that because you were talking about me landing.
Was it a Boeing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Frightening.
It doesn't make me feel better.
Yeah, it's frightening.
I was just
how you want Amber to close this out?
No, well, what you're offering to me, what you both are, is like neocolonialism is like this last. I don't think that's the last stage of colonization, but it's as if neocolonialism never happened, where the people who look like us are now in charge of doing the everyday harm. But that's also, if you look at whether it was the Congo or any of these places, how did we get here? I think Hortense Spiller says these are intramural questions for us to kind of consider. And to be raceless to me would be to come to terms with in many ways, like our indigeneity and our relationships that never really, there was no metabolization of the traumas that were happening before we got put into ships or into dungeons and brought over here. We just brought all that stuff with us, and maybe there were ceremonies or rituals to lead towards different outcomes, but here we are. And I was wondering if you had any capacity to offer us a closing prayer or a reflection towards maybe a death ritual, maybe a prayer that we can have a death ritual if you feel like that's more within the space. And then of course, if not, by all means, right? However spirit moves you. But that's what was coming up for me a while ago.
Yeah. Well, I will, I'll offer this and maybe a song as the closing prayer.
Yes.
Yeah. To what Tiffani was bringing to light around the guy who was doing the raceless thing, that stop, like it feels like accelerate but pull back, accelerate, pull back, is a part of this process of emergence. Like even us dealing with the fact remains, racialization as an invention, a social invention, did a thing to us. So in most indigenous cosmologies, African cosmologies, I'm using Haiti right now, Vodun, the term used, the thing prized most is balancer. It means balance. Everything is about orchestrating balance, which means while I hold the fact that this was an invented social agreement, I can still hold the fact that it has a material impact.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
It doesn't mean, because of the material impact, that I can overlook bad character because somebody's fucking black. Like, what the hell? What are we talking about here? What kind of moral override are we socializing ourselves into if we perform that and call it liberatory? That is a problem, and people should call it out. So there's a balance. And for me, that's the purpose of ritual. That's the purpose of what they call the work, where you wake up and you try each day that the sun comes up Like, what kind of spaciousness do I need to hold this balance of my ethics and values, but also the context of where I'm actually living? Right? The fact that rent is $3,000, but we still have homeless people. That shit is messed up, y'all. It's not right. And never should it be made to feel right. You know? And then segueing into what you said about Horton Spillers and like the fact that, yes, let's say on the continent, people who look like us, who have black skin, are now the perpetuators of colonial values and ideals. May this guide your own decolonial death rituals. Harm is not exclusive to the last 800 years. The invention of race cannot hold all of the harm on the planet or in the timeline of the human family.
No.
That is one blip or glimpse.
Yes.
So the work then becomes expanding outward to see, oh, wow, this happened and perhaps wasn't metabolized. This also occurred in another region of the earth. And they actually did something with that. They were able to integrate and move through the, but the notion, which is where I think we get stuck in modernity a lot, is to move through the world and think that the only bad thing that's ever happened on the planet happened just to black people in the last 400 to 800 years. Not possible. Not possible. So if that's the way you define decolonial, problematic. You're limited. The narrowing. Yeah. So the prayer then becomes, the ritual is, how do I create more psychic space? In all the places where I get narrow, tight, and shut down, I can't let anything new in. And I'm not saying go with everything, because I'm sure not the one. Let your critiques be critiques. Sorry, guys.
No worries.
We are the church bells, no less. So yeah, may the ritual become, how can I create more psychic space? So I will offer this song. Most of my singing is in the folkloric traditions, Haitian, Brazil, Cuba. And this song was taught to me by a beloved teacher, and it translates to "Nu tout zanj, I am the angel on earth. Zanj en bas, c'est moi, the angel on earth am I." And then it talks about Dambala Wedo, Aida Wedo, which is the male and female creation serpents from Benin that traveled to Haiti. And the song's message is about when they were witnessing bodies ripped apart, devastation and atrocity. In the ripping, I tap back into the source of creation and I recreate myself again and again. Nous tous ces anges, zanj en bas c'est moi. Nous tous ces anges, zanj en bas c'est moi. Dambala wedo, aida wedo. Nous tous ces anges, zanj en bas c'est moi. Nous tous ces anges, zanj en bas c'est moi. Nous tous ces anges, zanj en bas c'est moi. Dambalawedo, aidawedo. Nous tous si zanjo. Zanjamba semwen.
If that wasn't the blackest thing ever. Hey, the most beautiful
Y'all
part.
some food?
You want some
It's the
Say.
it's the concurrent rivers.
Yes.
That's right. And we're okay with all of them.
All of it. All of it. Ashe, ashe. Thank you
Ashe.
so much for
Thank
sharing
you,
that.
Sister
Tiffany.
Amber.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Sharing space with us.
Yes.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Oh, boy.
Thank you.
This podcast was brought to you by the Apocalyptic Education Network and the Institute for Regenerative Futures. It was filmed and recorded at Red Tone Records. Continue the conversation with me and Kenjus at apocalypticeducation.org.
Mommy,
Yes, Buddha.
all done.
Yeah, we're all done.